The don'ts of visiting America. This is going to be a fun one because, like all of us have certain things that we do in our behavior which we might think are totally normal, totally fine. Turns out they're not. So, as someone who enjoys going to America, plans to go soon, I think watching a video like this will help because, I don't ever want to do something that deliberately, I mean, not deliberately, but like ever offends anyone, and worst of all is when you don't even realize you're doing it. And it's just like, oh my God, I didn't mean to do it.
Salut! Welcome back to Unintentionally Frenchified. Today I'm launching part 2 of what not to do when you're visiting the US. So if you haven't seen part 1, you can check it out here. But today I've got 7 new really great tips to share with you. As always, I love hearing in the comments below what you agree with, what you disagree with. If you have any tips for people that you think I should have added to my list, please let me know below. I'm hoping that this video will be very useful when we can all start traveling again safely. Before we jump into my what not to do when visiting the US, I have some really faboosh news for all of my viewers out there that are looking to start not do when visiting the US. First things first, don't forget to tip. Guys, this is so rude when you actually forget. And I know it can be super confusing, and I understand that it's like, when do you tip? When do you don't tip? How much should I be tipping? And when you're not used to the tipping culture, it can be really confusing. But in the US, it's really important to remember that most servers, people working in restaurants, bartenders, they live off of their tips. So their minimum hourly wage is very small. It's not enough to live on because a majority of what they're making is coming from tips. So when you get good.
But okay, I'm not saying anything against tipping, but why is it legal to pay waiters, servers? Why is it legal to pay them so low per hour? That shouldn't be legal. I've got no problem with tipping, but the fact that you're making them rely on the tips seems a bit odd to me, don't you think?
Good service and you don't tip, you're really screwing somebody over. So it's really important to keep in mind that tipping in the US is very important. So, general rule of thumb to give you some ideas of when you tip. We tip when you're in a restaurant, if you're in a bar or a lounge and you're sitting down and someone's serving you drinks. We tip for taxis and cars and ride shares. If you're getting a personal service, so for example, a salon, getting your hair done, getting a massage, getting a tattoo, we would tip for that too. And also some smaller things like if someone helps with your luggage at the hotel or at the airport or housekeeping, we tend to leave a bit of tip as well. So in a general rule, I looked this up since I haven't lived in the US in a long time and I wanted to make sure the numbers were right. But on average, most people tip for the smaller stuff like your luggage or housekeeping, somewhere between $2 to $5 that they give. And then if it's a restaurant or a bar, you're sitting down and you're eating or you're drinking, that's more about 15 to 20% of the bill, of the cost of your meal before tax. You don't necessarily have to include tax in your 15 to 20%. I think it kind of depends. And of course, the idea is that you're tipping them because you had good service. It's up to your own discretion if the service isn't very good. But one of the great things about living in the US is because people live off of tips, often the service is pretty good.
Is it true that if you don't pay a tip in a restaurant, that they can chase after you? I read somewhere that someone got chased, and asked why they didn't receive a tip, why they didn't get a tip. Is that true? Surely, that can't happen. That can't. I'm just imagining someone.
Don't talk about very polarizing subjects. If I were you, I would really stay away from things like gun control, politics, abortion. I mean, these really polarizing subjects where people have their points of view and they're very passionate, is the right word maybe, about their points of view. In France, the French love a good debate. And I have been at dinner parties where we've spent hours debating about things and people have very different point of views and they're, really snapping at each other and debating and giving their point of view. And then when it's over, it's done. And the rest of the night just kind of carries on.
And I love that. That's how it should be, I think. Why do we have to, why can't we just talk? One of my best friends, like we disagree, on some quite, big things, but are still really, really good friends, like really good friends. I don't think you should have to like end friendships or like, not be able to discuss things. Or what do you think?
And nobody really thinks about the debate. I would say the general American doesn't have this type of mindset. We tend to be less of a debate culture, and we also tend to have our points of view and be very passionate, which ends up being very aggressive, and then we kind of don't forget what was said during a debate. And obviously I'm generalizing, but if you're going to just visit the US and you don't know people very well there, I think it's just super important to stay away from polarizing subjects. If you know people really well, go for it.
Do you imagine that I turn up in Dallas and I just go to some random guy, so what do you think about gun control? Yeah, no, if you're just visiting, there's no way. Like, why would I ever? I'm sure there are people though that do it. I'm sure there's people that turn up and they're just immediately like trying to, debate people and stuff. Just, it's not worth it.
Feel comfortable, but I don't know, it's really not a good idea to go into a bar, to drink a little bit too much, to start talking to the American next to you and start bringing up, I don't know, their political points of views. The climate in the US about politics is really polarizing right now, and I feel like you're going to get yourself into a conversation that's way more aggressive and maybe like borderline violent if there's alcohol than you had really expected. So I would just say shy away. Don't really involve yourself in the super polarizing subjects. I just don't think it's worth it on vacation. Do not respond honestly when someone asks, "How are you?" Somebody you don't know, of course. So when you walk into places like restaurants and stores in the US, we have a greeting in the US where we just say like, "Hello, how are you?" And we're not expecting an honest response back. So normally what I say is like, "I'm fine, thank you." And I keep walking if it's a store, or I give my name for the reservation. But I've never been like, "Oh, actually, I've had a really crap day and I just want to talk to somebody about it." I don't even know if the person who's asking would know how to respond. So I would just say tip. It's just a polite way of greeting people in the US. They're not really respecting a response back. And I know French people are like, well, then why do they say it? But it's just kind of like the way in France you absolutely have to say bonjour to people. Often you're going to get a hi, how are you? And just give a little, "I'm fine, thank you," and keep going along your business and you will be just fine.
Yeah, I think that one, if a family member or a friend of mine asks me how I am, I'll be totally honest. If I'm feeling pretty down in the dumps about something, I'll say so. And I imagine most of you guys are the same. Like if it's someone that that you have a bond with, then fine. But if it's just, some person at work or whatever, yeah, I mean, it's probably not the best idea to just offload all of your emotions onto them.
Don't think the price you see is the actual price. Ugh. Sales tax is one of the most annoying things I find when I actually go back to the US now.
I don't know why they just add the sales tax into the price. I just don't know why this is a thing. Add it into the price.
So something to keep in mind is that the price that you see on something is not actually the final price. It's the price without sales tax. And sales tax is added when you go up to the cashier. It's really, I can't go into detail about how much it is because this really differs by state. And this is also kind of the reason that I've at least read that we don't include sales tax in the final ticket prices, because it changes depending on where you're actually selling the goods. But in general, you just have to know that you can't really count your change out exactly before you get up to the cashier, because you never know how much is going to be added on. And of course, when it's like a candy bar that costs like $2, it's not a big deal for the extra 5 cents. But when you're going to buy like a $2,000 like electronic and they add like $250 on top, you're like, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me. So it's super frustrating, but just don't ever think that the price that you see is really the final price, because there's always going to be sales tax added on. And if you're in a restaurant, then you've got to add that tip on. So there's just some extra.
So you pay sales tax, like in a restaurant. So you pay sales tax and a tip on top. Whew.
Things at the end that you have to figure out. Don't generalize.
The sales tax one though, I just, why not have a flat nationwide rate so that you can just add it into the price on the tag? So here it's 20%, like on every pretty much everything. If you're a business and you turn over 80,000 a year, you can register yourself as a VAT register, so you don't have to pay VAT, something like that. But yeah, it's pretty much a flat rate, 20%.
It's all Americans. I feel like this shouldn't surprise any of the French people out there, because people hate when we talk about Parisian things and we call them French things. And I get this on a lot of my videos if I ever make this mistake. So you shouldn't be too surprised to know that Americans don't love it either. It's so large, the US, and there's so many states. And in every state, you've got your own culture and your own history and often your own vocabulary, your own way of doing things. And so it's normal, but someone from California isn't necessarily going to love being compared to somebody from Massachusetts, because maybe there's a lot of similarities, but maybe there's a lot of differences. I always talk to my husband about this, because he'll say things like, yeah, well, in the US, you can just, when you drive, it's always straight, and like for hours we go straight and we're never going up and down. And I'm like, yes, because I'm from the Midwest. And when we go home to visit my family, we're surrounded by cornfields and it's flat. But if you were asked, like my friends in Colorado, if driving is straight and flat, they'd say no, because there's so many mountains. So just keep in mind that the US is huge, and just like France, there's so many different regions and ways of doing things, and depending on where you're visiting and where you're going, your experience could be very different from somebody else visiting a different part of the US. So just, try not to generalize as much as you can, which is kind of funny because I'm literally generalizing right now in this video about Americans, but what can I do?
That's a valid one. I think it's because, so most countries are smaller than the US. So largely how things are done in Manchester will be pretty much the same as how things are done here in London. Like there's not much variance in the different cities, but because, California and New York are like, 2,000 miles away or whatever it is, that's such a big space. There really can be like some really different ways of doing things.
Don't walk in someone else's yard. So this
Wow,
one
really?
sounds like super bizarre, but I've actually seen people get in like shouting matches about people walking in their yard. And when I'm saying yard, I'm not talking about like acres of land. I'm talking about literally like a tiny little yard in front of their house. So it sounds crazy, but it's really, I think, more common than you could imagine. So
Is this because it's, your property? You don't want people on your property?
in the US, technically, it is illegal to walk on somebody else's lawn, no matter how big or how small it is. It's actually called trespassing. But I did a bit of research, and just FYI, there is like a slim to no chance that you would ever get a ticket from the police or get in actual trouble for walking on someone else's lawn. However, you might encounter a very aggressive person who takes it very seriously that you're walking on their lawn. So just in general, if you're meandering around towns where you're walking on people's streets, I wouldn't walk in their grass if I can avoid it. And if you're bringing like your dog along, for example, I wouldn't let them do their business in somebody else's grass. And if they do, I would just like pick it up, obviously quickly, and like kind of skedaddle out of there. It sounds like something so small, but it's really actually, I think, kind of like more important than you would think. So just stick to the sidewalks, look at the houses from afar, and you'll be good to go.
Why? Like Americans, like would you, if someone was walking in your yard, in your lawn, would you be really upset? Like, is it like, what about, is it disrespectful?
Don't say the US has no history or no culture. So I do get this quite a bit more than you would think in France. Sometimes when I'm like, I'm homesick for a bit of American culture or history or something, and I get the response like, do you want to go eat a cheeseburger? Or like, wait, you mean the 200 years of history in the US versus like the 1,000 years of history that you have here in France? And I'm like, okay, yes, I get it. We do not have the same like long history that you have in Europe, and you're not like most certainly not going to find like middle-aged buildings on every corner like you can see here. But we still do have some like historical and cultural things to be proud of in the US. We've got, great music like the blues and jazz, and we've got Hollywood films, and we do have our own cuisine, and we've got amazing like writers and poets, and we have great like top international schools for education. We do have some things to be proud of, guys.
Man, yeah, for the time that America's been a country, so much has happened. So much, in that 400-500 years, it's like Yeah, a lot of things have happened, you know.
Well, of course, we have many things to tweak. It's not all bad. And I think it's very much part of the French kind of like persona and personality to have a little bit of superiority, not just over Americans, but over just everybody, and think France is the best. So I do understand that, you know, that's just kind of the natural thing to do in France, is to kind of criticize. But in the US, we're, as I said, a little bit more sensitive, a little bit less into the criticism. So when you're visiting the US, I would just say leave a little bit of that teasing, like superiority at home, and just try to focus on some of the really cool stuff that you can see in the US. All right, guys, I hope you liked my 7 tips about what not to do when you're in the US. I will love to hear what you guys.
Yeah, the biggest one for me that I wasn't ready for, or not ready for, but like did completely unaware was the yard thing. You know, the walking across the yard. Like, does that apply to the front porch as well? So, because what if the pavement, you know, what if there's no pavement and you're walking along the road, you know, like you might have no choice but to walk across somebody's front yard. And gosh, I wouldn't want them to, you know, get really, really angry at me. Like, is it something that's still to this day, like really sort of looked down on if you do? Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.